He called himself the last king of Africa. He awarded himself medals he never earned, titles no one gave him, and a name so long it took 30 seconds to say out loud. But behind the absurdity, behind the gold-braided uniforms and the theatrical speeches, was something far more terrifying. Idi Amin Dada didn't just rule Uganda. He consumed it. And by the time the world fully understood what was happening inside those borders, somewhere between 100,000 and 500,000 people were already dead. This is not a story about a madman the world failed to stop. This is a story about how the world helped build him, and why it took 8 years for anyone to do anything about it. Uganda in 1971 was not some forgotten backwater. It was one of Africa's most promising nations. Winston Churchill had called it the Pearl of Africa. Fertile land, natural resources, a young, educated population. And then Idi Amin happened. Here's what that actually meant. A country that had every reason to become one of Africa's great success stories was about to be taken apart. Its economy, its judiciary, its military, its press, dismantled piece by piece in less than a decade. And the people paying that price weren't politicians. They were teachers, doctors, farmers, ordinary Ugandans who woke up one morning in a different country and never saw it coming. That's why this story matters. Not because Amin was strange, not because he was theatrical, but because what happened to Uganda was not an accident. It was a choice, made by many people, in many countries, and almost none of them were ever held accountable for it. By the late 1960s, Uganda had been independent from Britain for less than a decade. The country's first prime minister, Milton Obote, was a complicated man, authoritarian in his own right, but a political thinker, someone with an ideology and a vision for what Uganda could become. But Uganda was sitting on deep fault lines. The North and the South were divided by ethnicity, religion, and economic opportunity. The Buganda Kingdom in the South had always seen itself as a separate, superior entity within Uganda's borders. The northern tribes, the Akoli, the Langi, dominated the military but not the government. These tensions had never been resolved. They'd simply been managed, badly, by whoever happened to be in power. Obote leaned on the military to hold everything together. And the man he leaned on most was a barely literate army officer from the West Nile region. A man with no formal education beyond primary school. A man who had risen through the ranks of the British colonial army, the King's African Rifles, because he was enormous, fearless, and willing to do things other soldiers wouldn't. His name was Idi Amin Dada. Understand what Idi Amin was, and was not. He was not a political philosopher. He was not an ideologue. He had no coherent vision for Uganda's future, no economic plan, no grand theory of governance. What he had was something rarer and more dangerous, an instinctive, almost animal understanding of power. How to display it, how to project it, how to use fear as currency. The British colonial officers who served with him in the 1950s described him as a perfect soldier, obedient, physically commanding, enthusiastic about violence in ways that made him useful. He had participated in brutal land operations in Kenya during the Mau Mau uprising. He had tortured and killed on British orders. And the British had looked away because he was effective. When Uganda became independent in 1962, Amin was already a senior military figure. By 1966, Obote had made him commander of the army. It was the single most catastrophic appointment in Uganda's history. By 1970, the relationship between Obote and Amin had curdled into something close to open war. Obote had discovered that Amin was running illegal gold and ivory smuggling operations out of the Democratic Republic of Congo. There were investigations. There were threats of court-martial. Amin understood exactly what was coming. On January 25, 1971, while Obote was out of the country at a Commonwealth conference in Singapore, Idi Amin launched his coup. It was swift. It was brutal. And for a brief, bewildering moment, it was celebrated. The Buganda kingdom rejoiced. They despised Obote for abolishing their traditional monarchy. Western governments, including Britain and Israel, quietly welcomed the change. Obote had been moving toward African socialism, nationalizing industries, threatening Western economic interests. Amin, by contrast, seemed manageable, transactional, a military man with no dangerous ideas. What they failed to understand was that a man with no ideas is not a safer bet. He is the most dangerous bet of all, because a man with no ideology has no limits. He cannot be reasoned with through appeals to principle. He cannot be moderated by shared belief. There is only power and the terror required to keep it. Within weeks of the coup, Amin began eliminating anyone who might threaten him. He started with the military. Soldiers from the Akoli and Langi tribes, Obotes, ethnic groups, the backbone of the professional army, were systematically massacred. Not discharged, not imprisoned, massacred. Soldiers were locked in barracks and killed with sledgehammers to save ammunition. Bodies were dumped in the Nile. Reports from the time describe crocodiles in certain river sections growing fat on human remains. The scale of it was almost impossible to process. But the world was not paying close attention yet. In 1972, Amin made a decision that announced to the entire world exactly what kind of ruler he intended to be. He expelled Uganda's entire Asian population, approximately 80,000 people, most of them Indian and Pakistani, who had built the backbone of Uganda's commercial economy. He gave them 90 days to leave. Their businesses, their properties, their savings, confiscated. He said God had told him to do it in a dream. The economy collapsed almost overnight. The businesses Asians had built over generations were handed to Amin's military cronies, who had no idea how to run them. Shops emptied. Supply chains broke. Inflation exploded. The country Churchill had called the Pearl of Africa was dissolving into nothing. And then came the State Research Bureau. This was Amin's secret police, an organization whose brutality became legendary even by the standards of Africa's worst dictatorships. The Bureau's headquarters at Nakasero was a place people entered and did not leave. Torture was routine. Executions were theatrical. Bodies were sometimes dumped publicly, a deliberate message that nowhere was safe and no one was protected. The victims were not just political opponents. They were intellectuals, judges, clergymen. The Archbishop of Uganda, Janani Luwum, was murdered in 1977. Amin's own former cabinet ministers disappeared. 2 of his wives died under circumstances that were never adequately explained. The terror was not targeted, it was ambient, unpredictable, designed to make every Ugandan feel that survival required absolute, unconditional submission. Amin, meanwhile, played the international stage like a deranged theater director. He declared himself conqueror of the British Empire. He offered to marry Queen Elizabeth. He sent a telegram to Richard Nixon during Watergate expressing sympathy. He demanded that British businesspeople in Uganda carry him on a throne and prostrate themselves before him, and photographed the entire spectacle. The world laughed. And while the world laughed, people kept dying. The moment that cracked Amin's international isolation wide open was June 1976. An Air France flight was hijacked by Palestinian militants and diverted to Entebbe Airport in Uganda. Amin didn't just allow it. He welcomed the hijackers personally. He negotiated with them publicly. He gave speeches to the Jewish hostages, rambling, menacing, incomprehensible speeches, while the hijackers sorted passengers by nationality, separating the Jews from everyone else. The scene playing out at Entebbe Airport was not ambiguous. Amin was not a neutral party. He was a participant. And for the first time, the entire watching world could see it clearly. Israel's response became one of the most celebrated military operations in history. Operation Thunderbolt, the Entebbe raid. 100 Israeli commandos flew 4,000 kilometers through the night, stormed the terminal in the dark, killed every hijacker, and rescued 102 hostages. The entire operation took 53 minutes. By the time Amin's forces understood what was happening, it was already over. Amin was humiliated on the world stage. But humiliation only made him more dangerous internally. By 1978, his regime was collapsing under its own weight. The economy was broken. The military was fractured, unpaid, running extortion rackets across the country. Amin, increasingly paranoid, made the decision that would ultimately destroy him. He invaded Tanzania. He annexed a strip of Tanzanian territory called the Kagera region, claiming it for Uganda. It was perhaps the worst strategic decision of his reign. Tanzanian President Julius Nyerere had watched Amin for 8 years with barely concealed fury. Uganda's exiles had been organizing in Tanzania for years. Nyerere had the army, the will, and now the justification. Tanzania struck back with overwhelming force. By April 1979, Tanzanian troops and Ugandan exile forces were marching on Kampala. Amin's soldiers, unpaid and demoralized, collapsed almost immediately. There was no last stand. No dramatic final battle. His regime simply disintegrated, like paper in rain. On April 11, 1979, Kampala fell. Idi Amin fled, first to Libya, then to Saudi Arabia, where he would live in comfortable exile in Jeddah for the rest of his life, never facing trial, never facing justice, dying in 2003 from organ failure. He died in a hospital bed. What he left behind was almost incomprehensible. Between 100,000 and 500,000 Ugandans had been killed during his 8-year reign. The precise number will never be known because record-keeping itself had been destroyed. The economy had been reduced to subsistence-level ruin. The professional class, doctors, lawyers, engineers, academics, had fled or been killed. Institutions that take generations to build had been hollowed out entirely. Uganda did not simply recover once Amin was gone. The years that followed brought more violence. Milton Obote returned to power and launched his own campaign of atrocities in the Luro Triangle that killed tens of thousands more. It wasn't until Yoweri Museveni took power in 1986 that any kind of stability began to emerge, and even then, Uganda spent years rebuilding what 8 years of Amin had dismantled. The Asian community that had been expelled? Some returned after 1979. Most never did. The businesses, the properties, the capital, most of it was gone. Uganda's commercial recovery was set back by a generation. And the countries that had enabled Amin in his early years, Britain, Israel, the United States, quietly moved on. No reparations, no formal accountability, no serious examination of their own role in what had happened. Here is the uncomfortable truth that history keeps trying to teach us, and that we keep refusing to learn. Idi Amin was not an aberration. He was a product of colonial military systems that trained men in violence and taught them nothing else, of Cold War politics that valued ideological alignment over human rights, of Western governments that calculated that a controllable brute was preferable to an uncontrollable idealist. Every government that recognized his coup, every arms dealer that sold him weapons, every diplomat that shook his hand and said nothing, they all made the same calculation: that managing him was possible, that the cost of ignoring his crimes was acceptable. The Ugandans who lived through it paid that cost. Idi Amin is gone, but the question his rise poses has never stopped being relevant. What happens when the world decides that the suffering of some people is an acceptable price for the convenience of others? That question doesn't belong to 1971. It belongs to every year since.